What would you do if 60 of your bravest sons were killed? Not by accident, but by betrayal. President Ibrahim Traoré stood in silence, eyes fixed on the horizon, as 60 flag-draped coffins lay beneath the scorching African sun. They were not just soldiers, he whispered. They were our voices, and someone tried to silence us. Just days before the attack, Western envoys had arrived in New Kush, offering medals, handshakes, and promises of strategic cooperation. But Captain Traoré refused. No awards, no smiles, no deals. Then came the ambush. Fast, coordinated, and brutal. Drone signals jammed, communications severed, and 60 men gone. Coincidence or consequence? What does a nation do when morning turns to fire? This time, Africa will not cry. It will rise. Stay with us. This is not just about 60 fallen soldiers. It's about a country reclaiming its breath and a continent reclaiming its voice. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Subscribe now and stand with a new Africa, one that never kneels again. The attack didn't come in the dead of night. It came with the precision of a message. At 4:38 a.m. local time, a coordinated strike descended on the eastern military station near Dargo, a tactical corridor where New Kush had been quietly reinforcing border patrols. Not a single distress call made it through. Communications had been severed in the first 2 minutes, surveillance drones stationed nearby, offline, and no backup response until it was far too late. Was it just bad timing, or was it sabotage? Who had access to the transmission codes? Who knew the drill rotations? When President Ibrahim Traoré received the news, he said nothing. He turned to his chief of operations and asked just one question. Do we have satellite trace on any foreign aircraft in the last 6 hours? No reply, just lowered eyes. The bodies, 60 of them, were retrieved by noon. Each one wrapped in the national flag. Each one escorted in silence to Ouagadougou. The following morning, the capital stood still. Government buildings wore posters of the fallen. On the steps of the National Assembly, a long black banner read, "They didn't die in vain." Nationwide mourning was declared for 3 days. Schools across all 13 regions were closed. Public television displayed not entertainment, but portraits of each soldier with names, birthplaces, and ages. The youngest was just 19, the eldest 38. Most were fathers. All were sons of the land. But while the people wept, something else began to take root. Doubt. Only 4 days earlier, Traoré had rejected a U.S.-led award delegation in what insiders described as a sharp and unapologetic refusal. The Americans had called it a routine diplomatic gesture, but to Traoré it was theater, a performance wrapped in bait. He had stood his ground, said no, and shut the door. Now 60 men were dead. In Bobo Dioulasso, elders at the Grand Mosque held a prayer vigil, but outside in the courtyard, a heated conversation took place. "So this is the cost," one man said, gesturing at the radio report. "This is what we pay for standing straight." No one answered. At the University of Ouagadougou, students spray-painted the campus walls with a new slogan. Our dignity has a price, and we're paying it. Even in the media, a shift was felt. National outlets began using terms like strategic retaliation and coordinated message. One publication, La Faso Tribune, ran a bold headline, "Refuse the West, and they remind you who still holds the trigger." Yet through it all, President Traoré remained firm. Not a single statement of accusation, not one act of panic. Instead, behind the walls of the Cuba presidential complex, something different was happening. Documents were drafted. Military personnel were reassigned. A quiet expansion of the strategic command chain was signed by executive order. One close advisor described the atmosphere as controlled fire. Still, the public needed answers, and whispers grew into theories. Was this a punishment strike? If not by Western states, then by those funded, armed, or trained by them? Who benefited from Burkina Faso bleeding? And deeper still, what does this say about Africa's place in the global theater of power? Traoré didn't lecture. He didn't beg for sympathy. He issued one public directive: build the wall. We're not here to bury heroes. We're here to protect the living. Within hours, logistics teams began relocating drone fabrication equipment to the eastern frontier. Not a gesture of revenge, but preparation. Because if foreign hands had touched Burkina soil, they wouldn't do it twice without a response. Foreign embassies sent their condolences. Polite, predictable, perfumed in diplomacy. A few were read aloud in Parliament, most were left unopened. President Traoré walked past the pile of envelopes and looked straight through the window into the silent streets of Ouagadougou. "Tell them," he said to his chief of protocol, "Burkina Faso does not mourn with permission. There would be no symbolic wreaths, no press conferences of pity." The country didn't need sympathies. It needed a plan, something that would make the world think twice before testing Burkina Faso resolve again. Something that would make those who ordered the massacre wake up in cold sweats, wondering if they had awakened a sleeping giant. That evening, under heavy escort, Traoré visited a forgotten industrial complex just outside the capital, an abandoned maintenance facility once used for vehicle repairs during the Sankara era. The facility had been shuttered since the economic troubles of the 1990s. Its massive halls echoing with the ghosts of better times. The gates opened for the first time in years, rusty hinges screaming in protest. And under flickering overhead lights that cast dancing shadows on the concrete walls, the president walked the halls and ran his hand along the cold steel beams. The dust hung thick in the air, disturbed by footsteps that hadn't echoed here for decades. But Traoré saw something different. Where others saw decay, he saw potential. Where others saw abandonment, he saw opportunity. Where others saw the past, he saw the future of Burkina Faso defense. He turned to the engineers waiting inside, their faces illuminated by the harsh, industrial lighting. "We build here. We build now. And we build with our own. No foreign blueprints, no foreign materials, no foreign oversight. This will be ours, from foundation to finish." The engineers nodded, understanding the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about manufacturing. This was about sovereignty. This was about ensuring that Burkina Faso would never again be caught defenseless, never again be at the mercy of foreign powers who could strike and disappear like shadows in the night. 3 days later, the first shipment of composite shells for unmanned aerial vehicles arrived at the facility. The trucks rolled in before dawn, their cargo precious beyond measure. No imports, no foreign experts, just Burkina Bayans, minds, and will. Local metallurgists had worked around the clock to perfect the alloy compositions. University students had abandoned their textbooks to join the effort. This was not an act of vengeance. It was the architecture of deterrence. President Traoré signed the first directive of its kind, the creation of a state-funded drone weapons program led entirely by domestic scientists and military technicians. The blueprint remained confidential, locked in safes that only the president and his inner circle could access. But the ambition was boundless, limitless as the African sky. And while prototypes were being tested in the vast expanse beyond Ouagadougou's outskirts, the president met with the National Assembly's Defense Committee in the Parliament's secure wing. No media cameras, no foreign translators, just strategy. Raw, unfiltered planning for a new Burkina Faso. This is not reaction. This is recalibration. He told them, his voice steady and unwavering. If we wait for permission to defend ourselves, we've already surrendered. If we beg others to protect us, we've already lost our dignity. Across the country, posters of the 60 soldiers remained untouched on every street corner, their faces watching over the transformation of their homeland. But beside them, new images began to surface. technical schematics of drones, training manuals with Burkina Faso insignia, and maps marked in red, showing strategic positions along every border. People didn't just mourn anymore. They prepared with the focused intensity of a nation that had learned the cost of vulnerability. And Traoré made sure they would do so with purpose, with precision, with the kind of determination that could reshape the balance of power in West Africa. He unveiled Operation Culpelgo, a sweeping national program unlike any in Burkina Faso's modern history. Named after the traditional fortress-building technique of the Mossy kingdoms, the operation carried the weight of ancestral memory and the promise of never again. Its mandate was threefold: to train civilians in strategic defense, fortify the nation's borders using artificial intelligence, and establish decentralized tactical response units in all 13 regions. The scope was breathtaking. AI-enhanced radar systems were ordered from domestic tech companies, adapted specifically to detect low-flying objects in rural zones where traditional radar failed. Community halls across the country were converted into readiness centers, their stages that once hosted cultural performances now serving as platforms for defense training. Former teachers became military instructors, their chalkboards replaced with tactical maps. Farmers became reconnaissance scouts, their deep knowledge of the land transformed into strategic advantage. And in the heart of it all stood a belief so powerful, it seemed to pulse through the nation's very veins. Burkina Faso would never be caught unready again. The transformation was visible everywhere. In villages that had never seen military personnel, retired officers emerged from civilian life to train the next generation. In schools where children once learned only mathematics and literature, new subjects appeared: situational awareness, basic communications, emergency response protocols. If your leader refused to kneel, armed your people with purpose, and turned grief into strategy, would you follow him to the end? Share your thoughts below. And if you believe Traoré is the kind of leader Africa needs, type Amen in the comments. In the western town of Benora, where the memorial to the fallen soldiers drew visitors from across the region, a retired colonel named Samuel Konaté looked over the new training curriculum and shook his head in awe. His weathered hands traced the pages of manuals that covered everything from drone operation to psychological warfare. This, he said to a visiting reporter from the National News Service, is not about revenge. This is about memory, turning it into muscle. This is about ensuring our children never experience what we experienced. Within the first week, over 4,000 citizens registered for local defense education programs. The response overwhelmed organizers, forcing them to establish waiting lists and expand facilities. In Fonora, traditional hunters whose families had tracked wildlife for generations taught terrain reading to school leavers, passing down centuries of knowledge about wind patterns, animal behavior, and natural camouflage. In Djibo, computer science students abandoned their final projects to write algorithms for thermal drone detection, their university computers humming through the night as they coded the future of Burkina Faso security. And while the international community issued routine concerns and diplomatic protests inside Burkina Faso, a revolution of readiness had begun. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, methodical, and utterly determined. 48 hours after the attack that killed 60 of Burkina Faso soldiers, a military aircraft landed at the Bobo Dioulasso airstrip, gray, unmarked, silent. From its ramp descended 11 men in black tactical uniforms, Russian special operations instructors. They didn't arrive with promises or preconditions. They came to work. President Traoré had not begged for assistance. He had not dispatched envoys to Moscow or pleaded at summits. His orders were clear. They come on our terms, or they don't come at all. One of his senior aides recalled the moment. He stood up during the war room briefing and said, This is our land. If Russia wants to support Africa, they will do it with dignity, or not at all. This wasn't military dependency. It was strategic cooperation. By the third day, those Russian operatives were already deep in joint drills with Burkina Faso elite units, training for urban counterstrikes, drone interceptions, and remote border warfare. The instruction manuals translated into French overnight. The command structure entirely under Burkina Faso sovereignty. No private security firms, no mercenaries. No foreign flags flying over domestic bases. Just collaboration, calculated, mutual, respectful. The West noticed. Suddenly, foreign embassies began issuing statements of concern. Think tanks in Paris and Washington rushed to circulate policy memos titled Russia's Advance in the Sahel. But inside Burkina Faso, no one was panicking. They were preparing. That same week, Captain Ibrahim's latest news hit the international wires. He had green-lit a doctrinal overhaul of the national defense architecture. His vision, a bold new strategy, now being whispered across military academies from Ouaga to Nami. The African doctrine of retaliation. A doctrine forged not in theory, but in blood. Its first pillar, total defense sovereignty. No more foreign bases, no outsourced command, no borrowed intelligence. Build locally, train natively. Deploy independently. Its second strategic disruption, countering not just physical invasion, but digital surveillance, economic pressure, and diplomatic coercion, a resistance that spans from the battlefield to the boardroom. Its third, civic militarization, not a conscription model, a mindset, every citizen trained, every school, a knowledge base, every village a node in the defense web. One senior Russian instructor speaking to local press under anonymity said, "I've worked in Syria, Ukraine, the Caucasus, but here you don't just see soldiers. You see an entire population standing alert." At the new Joint Operations Facility on the outskirts of Tenkogo, Traoré addressed both Burkina officers and Russian tacticians. "We are not assembling weapons for aggression. We are assembling discipline. If you aim a drone at our people, we will aim resilience back at you." And what does it mean when a small West African country dares to define its own defense terms on its own soil with its own resources? What does it mean when that same country, led by a man barely 36, tells global superpowers, "You don't get to choose our allies"? In Europe, analysts debated headlines. In Washington, the Pentagon flagged Burkina Faso satellite data for weekly updates. But in Kaya and Gorsi, Burkina Faso children were painting murals of President Traoré beside armed farmers and tech students with laptops. Across Tikare, old griots composed new chants. Burkina Faso latest news wasn't just about conflict, it was about clarity. And clarity was contagious. Mali sent observers to witness the new drone command protocols. Niger dispatched cyber officers to study signal encryption techniques from the Russian-Burkina alliance. In a closed-door trilateral session held near the Sahelian border, the first joint policy draft for a Sahelian defensive union was completed. Its title, The Wall of Resistance. Traoré didn't just inspire movement, he institutionalized it. From satellite-resistant bunkers buried deep in the northern mountains to grassroots war literacy programs in schools, from remote village briefings conducted by traveling military advisors to algorithmic surveillance systems in military corridors, he wove an intricate tapestry of collective defense, one not born of fear and paranoia, but of foresight and calculated preparation. The orders didn't come with drums or fanfare. They came with silence and conviction, passed from ministry to ministry, from commander to commander, from teacher to student. In a quiet village north of Zinière, where the morning mist still clung to baobab trees, an old blacksmith named Kango sharpened his tools at dawn. Not for trade, not for cattle, for readiness. The rhythmic ring of hammer on anvil had taken on new meaning in recent weeks. At his side, 3 boys from the local school arrived with scraps of metal collected from around their village and whispered with excitement, "We're ready to learn the old ways." Kango's weathered hands guided theirs as he taught them not just how to shape metal, but how to understand its properties, its strengths, its potential uses in ways their textbooks had never mentioned. The old skills, he told them, were being reborn with new purpose. Meanwhile, in a dusty square in Dugu, where the ancient baobab tree had stood witness to centuries of change, griots, keepers of oral tradition and the living memory of the people, gathered around a fire that crackled against the evening air. One of them, Maddie, her voice carrying the weight of generations, stood and began a verse that seemed to rise from the very earth beneath their feet. When the nation bled, the cowards ran. But the brave picked up songs and turned them into spears. They took drums and made them into shields. They took stories and made them into strategies. It wasn't poetry anymore. It was preparation. It was the transformation of cultural memory into practical resistance. President Traoré's message had reached beyond soldiers and politicians. It had passed through ministers, crossed the airwaves, traveled down dirt roads, and landed in the streets, homes, and hearts of ordinary people who suddenly understood that they too had a role to play in their nation's defense. He didn't just say defend, he showed them how. He gave them the tools, the training, the confidence to believe that they could make a difference. Each of Burkina Faso's 13 regions began transforming in ways both subtle and profound. In Toma, a carpenter's guild that had built homes for generations converted its main warehouse into a training ground where members learned not just how to construct buildings, but how to fortify them, how to create hiding places, how to design structures that could serve multiple purposes in times of crisis. In Gawa, retired military scouts who had served along the borders during previous conflicts mapped local terrain with GPS precision and taught young men how to read the land in complete darkness, how to move silently through forests, how to use natural features for concealment and advantage. But what does it mean when grandmothers begin stitching camouflage patterns into ceremonial robes? When children's games start incorporating military tactics? When farmers begin viewing their fields not just as sources of food, but as potential battlegrounds that might need defending? Captain Ibrahim's latest news wasn't about troop deployments or weapons acquisitions. It was about cultural mobilization on a scale that hadn't been seen since the independence struggles decades earlier. The Ministry of Heritage and Identity, working closely with the Defense Ministry, released a groundbreaking directive that authorized traditional knowledge holders, hunters whose families had tracked animals for centuries, iron workers who understood metallurgy in ways universities couldn't teach, dancers whose movements could be adapted for tactical training, to train local youth in terrain logic, animal tracking, and symbolic resistance. The program was voluntary, but the response was overwhelming. Parents brought their children not because they were forced to, but because they understood that knowledge was power, that preparation was survival, that their culture and their security were intertwined in ways they hadn't fully appreciated before. In Yako, a group of teenage girls worked together to paint a mural that covered the entire side of their school building. The image showed President Traoré, his arm raised in determination, standing beside a freedom tree planted by their own hands. Every school in the country had planted one, a total of 60 freedom trees across Burkina Faso, each named after one of the fallen soldiers, each serving as a living memorial and a symbol of resilience. Next to the saplings, bronze plaques read simply, "You fell so we may rise." The words had been chosen by the students themselves, approved by grieving families who found comfort in knowing their sons' sacrifices were nurturing new growth. Classrooms across the nation echoed not just with traditional lessons of algebra and literature, but with new chants that children learned alongside their multiplication tables. We stand, we defend, we remember. The words became part of morning assemblies, part of graduation ceremonies, part of the rhythm of daily life. Traoré visited one of these schools unannounced on a Tuesday morning, his security detail arriving just minutes before his modest convoy. The students, alerted by their teachers, stood at attention in the courtyard. One girl, no more than 14, stepped forward and handed him a folded piece of paper. Inside, written in careful blue ink, was a poem that would later be quoted in newspapers across Africa. We do not learn history to remember the pain. We learn it to name our enemies and recognize their tactics. We learn it to understand the cost of freedom and the price of weakness. He folded the paper slowly, his hand steady despite the weight of the moment, and looked her directly in the eye. Then name them well, he said quietly. And never forget to name yourselves first as guardians of everything your ancestors built and everything your children will inherit. The headlines changed overnight. Yesterday they called him young and daring. Today they called him reckless and dangerous. Across global media, the tone had shifted. Western anchors, once fascinated by Captain Ibrahim Traoré's rapid rise, now whispered of instability. Policy writers in London and Washington inked concern. Is Burkina Faso drifting into extremism? But inside Bobo Dioulasso, inside Tenodogo, inside Ouaga itself, no one was drifting. They were digging in. President Traoré stood at the center of a swirling storm. But unlike most, he leaned into it. In a late-night emergency session, one of his advisors cautioned, "They've begun freezing bilateral aid, sir. It's retaliation." Traoré didn't blink. Then we retaliate with independence. This was never about revenge. It was never about 60 brave sons laid under the red earth. It was never just about retaliation. This was Africa's awakening. What began as a strike against soldiers turned into a spiritual siren, the kind that echoes beyond borders and breaks centuries of silence. From the heart of Burkina Faso, President Traoré did not react with fury. He responded with vision. He rewired policy. He rearmed a people. And more importantly, he reminded an entire continent of its worth. Traoré is no longer just a leader. He is the living pulse of an ideological resistance. A movement that does not wear suits, that does not bow to Western applause, and that does not forget the names of its dead. He walks among mechanics, students, hunters, poets, and they do not cheer. They prepare. Ask yourself, when was the last time a president cried not in weakness, but in promise? He didn't just bury the fallen, he planted their legacy into soil, policy, and spirit. What side of history will you be on? Will you scroll past, or will you stand with those who refuse to kneel? The African doctrine of retaliation is no longer a military phrase. It's a mirror held up to every African state still waiting for foreign permission to dream. So now what will follow? Will this ripple become a wave? Will Mali and Niger and Chad join the path of sovereign readiness? Will the continent write its next chapter with iron and ink made by its own hands? Type 1 Africa in the comments if you believe it's time. Wherever you're watching from, Accra, Atlanta, Brixton, or Baltimore, this is your story too. Share your thoughts. What does African freedom look like to you? Would you defend it? Should we build walls of resistance or bridges of truth? Let your words breathe in the comments. Tag your brothers, your sisters. Share this video on WhatsApp, in churches, in barbershops. Speak it where our history was silenced. And if this moved something inside you, something your grandmother once hummed, something your grandfather once fought for, then don't just watch, like, share, speak, subscribe because they buried our voices for too long. Let's speak our future together. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next one.